All right. Well, appreciate you all being here today for this program on the native edible medicinal plants for your Ozark garden. My name's Eric Fuselier. I have a little organization. It's really just a one-person deal. Basically, when I'm doing anything that involves edible medicinal plants, any sort of primitive living skills, friction fire, flint knapping, anything like that, I kind of operate under the name of Ozark Primitive Skills. But today I'm doing a program here for the Bentonville Public Library, and I'm glad that all of you could make it here today to learn about this topic, which I've really enjoyed studying over the past many years since I was a child with my parents out in the woods, gathering blackberries and other things. And then as I got into being an adult, spending more time in the wilderness as a hiker and backpacker, just trying to learn what could I live on, or what could I consume while I'm out in the woods to make my time out there much more enjoyable. It kind of enhance my experience in nature and enhance my connection to nature. And again, this is kind of my logo here, Ozark Primitive Skills, along with my saying or slogan, learn to live in the wild. I teach these classes at various locations like the Ozark Natural Science Center, Hobbs State Park. I got some classes coming up at these locations in October. So if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, feel free to reach out to me. And there's some photos of some classes I've taken. And hold on, let me do one real quickly with my daughter who's in the background, just to kind of get her set up. Hey, sweetie, can you bring me the thing? You opened it by yourself. Good job. All right, thank you all. Appreciate your patience. I got my 6-year-old here with me at the office and just trying to keep her occupied for the next hour while we do this. Sounds like she opened a can of LaCroix bubbly soda for the first time all by herself. So, all right, let's get going. So, want to kind of, since we're talking about our Ozark gardens, and a lot of the plant, a lot of times I give this talk in the past, it's been, more in the perspective of when you're out hiking and backpacking, you come across what plants, what's edible, what has medicinal properties. Then I started getting this talk, people from different master gardener groups started requesting that I do this program, or for the Rogers Garden Club. So then I started focusing more on plants that were could be grown in a garden setting. I mean, some native plants, aren't really able to be transplanted as well or started. Some of them are really dependent on certain relationships in the forest soil. But then, kind of narrowed it down to species that were a little more cultivatable, because, native plant gardening is becoming more and more of a popular thing, whether you're growing native plants for pollinators, wildlife, or just for all kinds of other things for the beautiful flowers, or in this case, maybe you want to include some native plants for food and medicine in your garden. And this talk, this time, I decided to kind of give a little more focus to the idea of forest gardening, which was a term that was coined by Robert Hart. And it was something that was practiced in prehistoric times in tropical forests. Of course, in tropical forests, a lot of what grows under the canopy is adapted to shade. And in a forest setting, that's typically what you're going to have, at least when you get too far away from the edge of the forest, it's going to be pretty shady. And so it does kind of limit here in the temperate regions what species would grow in a forest. But it's not to say there aren't plenty of other species. Whenever you have enough canopy opening, maybe like a woodland setting where the canopy isn't completely closed, or you have enough edges, there can still be enough light for many of the species. So this talk, I'm kind of tailored it to some species that would be able to be grown in a food forest, which is an idea in permaculture of a low maintenance, sustainable plant-based food production system based on woodland ecosystems, and incorporates plants which have yields directly useful to humans. But in this case, not all food forests use native species. Some use more cultivated species. But in this case, we're going to use focus on native species, because not only will these species be useful to humans, but they're also useful to many other species of beneficial insects and wildlife. And so just with the idea that if you try to take on a project like this, it is a long-term project to get a full food forest fully developed. I mean, that's pretty much a lifelong project that you'd be undertaking with the idea of maybe leaving it to your children or someone else that might be a little younger. And also, you know, understand that you might be sharing some of that food with some wildlife, and that's just kind of part of what goes with that. Especially when using native species. And since we are in a temperate region, and some of the species here do require at least partial sun or some sunlight, just keep in mind that you'll need to have some openings where the sun's able to kind of, at least for part of the day, is able to reach the forest floor. Or some of these species you'll have to plant along the edges. So having a food forest that's maybe you know, not so large to where you have a nice perimeter around it where you can plant a lot of these species that are not the trees, like the herbaceous species, with the understanding that in the center of that food forest, you'd have to stick to more full shade tolerant species. So Robert Hart has a 7-layer system for the food forest. So we start off with the canopy layer. These are going to be, of course, the tallest trees. These consist of these mature trees that are going to be bearing fruit, nuts, all that sort of stuff. Below that, what he calls the low tree layer, or what others you might hear in the literature call the mid-story. These are going to be smaller trees or large shrubs that have smaller produce nuts and fruits. And then the shrub layer, which is, you know, might be head high to waist height. These are going to be fruit bushes such as wild currants, other berries, and, you know, other things that produce leaves we can use. And I'll go into some of those here in a little bit. And then on the forest floor, we'll have the herbaceous layer. So these are the non-woody species. So the shrubs and trees, of course, are woody species. You know, they have that woody mass that after, you know, during the winter time, that woody part sticks around through the winter. And then, you know, when the next spring comes along, it starts growing leaves again. Well, the herbaceous layer at the end of the growing season, when it starts to become winter, those plants die back down to the ground surface, and then those roots hang out in the soil and will then produce a new plant the next year if it's a biannual or perennial. If they're annual species, then they will have completed their entire life cycle in 1 year. And so those tend to produce a lot more seeds, the annuals do, because they want to make sure that there's more of them the next year. Then level 5, the rhizosphere, or what's known as like the root zone. When you see rhizo, that's usually referring to the roots. And this is the underground part where plants are going to be grown for their roots and tubers. Level 6, a ground cover layer. So this would be something maybe lower down than the herbaceous layer. These are going to be edible plants that spread horizontally. And we'll talk about some native species that can do that. And then 7, the vertical layer. These are the vines and climbers, things that would go, you know, start at the bottom and work their way up the trees and produce fruits in the process. All right, so let's start off with this canopy layer. What are some different canopy trees that we can include in a food forest? Well, common persimmon. You know, some of these are going to be smaller. You know, I kind of debated whether to include this in the low tree layer or not, but I have seen some persimmons that get mature and do seem to be just as tall as, you know, your average oak or maple. So common persimmons, the fruits are edible. They're getting close to being ripe, probably not quite ripe just yet. Usually October, late September at the earliest is when these are going to be ripe. If they're not ripe, they're going to be astringent, and that's because of the tannic acid in there. But you can, once they are ripe, you know, and some people will say after we've had a frost, but I've also heard that's not always true. It just the frost tends to be timed well whenever they become ripe. So, I mean, I'm not certain if the frost is truly necessary or if it's just more of the timing. But you can eat them raw, prepared in jams, teas, or bread. Have some persimmon bread. It's delicious. The dried leaves can also be made into a tea that is rich in vitamin C. But like I said, just warning, it does contain tannins or tannic acid, which in large amounts could potentially be toxic. So if you're eating those, making some tea with those leaves for vitamin C, just keep in mind that you don't want to have too much of that. It can make your tummy sick. And also keep in mind that with vitamin C, the temperature at which it breaks down is relatively low, so you don't want to have a boiling hot tea. Generally a cold tea is going to be best to get the most vitamin C, or just slightly warm and let it infuse a little bit longer in order to get those benefits. As far as medicinal parts, and this is the inner bark of the tree, highly astringent, and that's where we might be able to use those tannic acids for certain beneficial properties. Like in folk use, they would use a gargle for sore throats and thrush. So that tannic acid kind of helps tighten some stuff up in the throat, maybe helps kill off anything that maybe can't handle that tannic acid. Bark tea is once used as a folk remedy for stomach aches, heartburn, diarrhea, dysentery, and uterine hemorrhage, as well as a wash or poultice for warts and cancers. All right, and then the sugar maples, some other canopy trees. We have several different species of maples here in the Ozarks that are native: sugar maples, red maples, silver maples, and box elders, and then some very rare species like the black maple. But sugar maples are one of the most well-known, especially for the ability to tap them and get syrup. But also the seeds are edible. You can take those seeds, or grow in what's called a samara, so they're like these two little wings that come off, and within each wing, there's the seed casing, and in each one is a little bean or a little pea. You could take those out and eat those. You can cook them or eat them raw. So pretty tasty, slightly bitter, but you can mix it in with other stuff and say like a salad. The bark and the sap is said to be medicinal. Native Americans would use the inner bark tea for coughs, diarrhea, diuretic, expectorant, or as a blood purifier. So notice some of the same things that the persimmon bark was used for. Maple syrup is also said to be a liver tonic and kidney cleanser, and so has been used in cough syrup. So if you want to make your own homemade cough syrup, you might include some maple syrup. Just keep in mind, just with blood sugar, that sort of thing, that you're able to consume doses of sugar without doing any harm to you if you have any diabetes or anything. Red maples, another species of maple. The seeds and sap are also edible, just like the sugar maple, and just all the same uses as the sugar maple. You can eat the bean, little bean-like fruit in each one of those little samara wings. And then you can collect the sap to make syrup. All right, so what about low tree layer, that mid-story? Some species include rusty blackhaw. This is one that foragers like to refer to as wild raisins. You see those fruit there in the left-hand photo, and those will shrivel up on the plant, usually at the end of the growing season, early winter, and they can be picked off when they're all shriveled up and eaten raw. That's why they're called wild raisins. They look like raisins growing there on the plant. So it is a winter food source, at least through part of the winter, and I have seen some of those hang on throughout the entire winter into the following spring. They're usually not good by that point. I've tried to chew one, and it's pretty hard and leathery and not very great, but the fruit can also be made into jams. You can make a drink. You can mash these fruits, place it in hot water, agitate it occasionally until the flesh is dissolved, strain it to remove the skin and seeds, and have some rusty blackhaw, kind of a mash drink. Then pawpaws, host plant of the zebra swallowtail butterfly. So anytime I see a zebra swallowtail fluttering around, I know there's a good chance of pawpaws nearby. But the ripe fruit are edible. These are starting to get ripe. I've seen some people report on social media that they're eating some ripe pawpaws. They will be ready to eat through the end of September, maybe early October. I've had them in August, and they were too astringent still at that point. I've had my best luck mid to late September. So you can eat these raw. They have a sweet custard-like flavor, cut texture. The flavor has often been compared to a cross between a banana, mango, and papaya. This is also the largest indigenous fruit to North America. So it's what we have here of all of our wild fruits, this one is the largest. Its shelf life is pretty short, which has made it, unfortunately, not a great plant for distribution across the United States and sold in the grocery stores. Hasn't been as good for, the mass market, large market, but typically you can find some locally grown ones at some farmers markets. There's a gentleman who has a pawpaw orchard, Guy Ames, just outside of Fayetteville, and I believe he sells his to Ozark Natural Foods and some other locations. So if you have a chance to buy one of these in the grocery store, do yourself a favor and pick one up. The trees do take, I've read, about 17 years before they'll start producing fruit after you've planted them. So it's kind of a long-term deal that you have to be, have to play the waiting game there. Or is it 17 or 7? You're looking, it's quite a while. It's not going to produce fruit just right away, and you do need to have more than one pawpaw tree far enough apart in order for them to be able to pollinate or have their the flowers pollinated to be able to. For some reason they're not able to pollinate themselves, and it's a little bit complex. It's not as easy as them not being self-compatible, but something to do with the flowers, and it needs another tree in order to be pollinated. Medicinal parts include the ripe fruits, leaves, and seeds. The fruits are laxative, so keep that in mind if you're eating a ton of them. If you start to notice that you're kind of cleaning yourself out, that might be why. The leaves are said to be insecticidal, and I know if you take a pawpaw leaf and you crush it and smell it, it has like this acrid kind of smell. It reminds me of green bell peppers, really, but and I've heard that people could rub that on themselves to kind of deter insects like mosquitoes, but that really only lasts as long as you're not sweating it off, which out here in the Ozarks, if there's mosquitoes around, you're probably also doing a little bit of sweating, so you'd have to keep applying that over and over. But it's not to say that you can't use that insecticidal property in other ways as well. Leaves are also said to be diuretic. So if you're trying to pass a lot of water, that could be one way. One thing you could use has been applied to abscesses as well. The seeds are emetic and also considered a narcotic. Emetic meaning something that's going to make you vomit. So maybe you've ingested something that you shouldn't have, or you're trying to get it out of your system. Then taking some of the seeds could be a way to help you throw that stuff up. Powdered seeds formerly applied to the heads of children to control lice. That's one use of that insecticidal property. Let's see, the seeds and probably leaves also and bark potentially can contain potentially useful anti-cancer yet potentially toxic acetogenins. And leaves may cause a rash. All right, then we get down to the shrub layer. This is going to be, these bushy plants. So we could have, we have several different species of wild blueberries, a Vaccinium genus, including Vaccinium pallidum. These are typically ripe in the summertime, June through September. You can eat those fruits. These are delicious. A lot of our wild blueberries are going to like slightly lower pH soils, just like our cultivated blueberries. So the places in the wild you want to look for these are going to be under pine trees and pine groves, or places with sandstone bedrock that's close to the surface, so it imparts like a slightly lower pH to the soil. So just keep that in mind. If you're doing a food forest, you might have to account for that and provide it with the level of pH that it needs. Deerberry, another species of wild blueberry, a little bit taller than the hillside blueberry. Usually gets to be about waist or chest height, whereas hillside blueberry, in my experience, usually gets to be about knee high. And then Farkle berries, these can be as tall as you are. These bloom same time in the summertime, starting in June. A lot of places I tend to see these in the wild are going to be these rocky outcroppings of sandstone glades, those sorts of areas. And then northern spice bush. This is another multi-use plant. It's also the host plant for the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. Edible parts include the leaves, twigs, and berries. During the growing season, you can collect the leaves. If you ever come across one of these plants, which they're very common in the wild, you take a leaf, break it open and smell it, and it has a very citrusy scent to it, and it makes a delicious tea. So you can take a few of those leaves, infuse it in some hot water, and enjoy the tea. The berries are edible, not just, they're more of a flavoring. They have been used as a substitute for allspice. And so if you collect these berries in October, save them, let them dry out, and then crush them up, then they make a great allspice substitute. Last October, my daughter and I went and we were hiking and collected a bunch of allspice berries. And then she and my wife later used them in November to make our pumpkin pie, and it just turned out great. The twigs also contain the same compound that's in the leaves that make it great for tea. So it's a wintertime source. If you take these twigs, cut them up into small pieces to help increase the surface area, and then infuse that in some hot water, just like you would the leaves, you can have a wintertime tea. Medicinal parts include the leaves and berries. The Native Americans would use the berry tea for coughs, cramps, delayed menses, croup, and measles. Would make a tea with the bark as a blood purifier and for sweatings, colds, rheumatism, and anemia. Twig tea was popular for colds, fevers, worms, gas, and colic. The bark tea was also once used to expel worms, for typhoid fevers, and as a diaphoretic for other forms of fever. So if you're needing to break that fever, this might be one. It's going to increase your body temperature if you make a bark tea with it, and help you sweat out some of those colds, help cook them off. So an extract of the stem bark has also been found to strongly inhibit yeast. So you have any sort of infections anywhere that you could use it for that as well. New Jersey tea, another bush. The leaves can be used to make tea, hence the name New Jersey tea. The New Jersey part of its name comes from back in the colonial era, and when the early American colonists were protesting British tea. This was one of the tea plants that they turned to as a tea substitute, but it does not contain caffeine. So I imagine they would have had some caffeine withdrawal. But we do have some native species of caffeine producing plants here in the United States, although they do not grow in Arkansas or in the Ozarks, but Yaupon holly is a native holly here to North America. That does contain caffeine. You can grow it in a garden setting, but it does not grow naturally in the wild up here. But Ilex Vomitoria, that one is species named Vomitoria because the natives had a ceremonial drink that they would create, what they called the black drink, or what was termed the black drink by early ethnographers, and it was a drink mixed with all kinds of different things, and one of those included the leaves from Yaupon holly. And so it was a drink. I'm not sure if it caused hallucinations or not, but it would cause vomiting, similar to ayahuasca in South America. But it was something they drank ceremonially, and whenever the early botanist or naturalist who named it Ilex Vomitoria was aware that that was something that was in that drink, so he named it Ilex Vomitoria. But New Jersey tea, the roots are medicinal. The Native Americans would use root tea for colds, fevers, snake bites, stomach aches, lung ailments as a laxative and blood tonic. Also, the root tea has been used for dysentery, asthma, sore throats, bronchitis, whooping cough, spleen inflammation or pain. That root is strongly astringent, has high contents of tannins, 8%. As an expectorant and sedative. An alkaloid in the root is mildly hypotensive. Then there are the Hypericums, or St. Andrew's cross, or otherwise known as, what's the name? Slipping my brain. St. John's wort. So has been used in the past as an antidepressant, or for people that are using this medicinally. I've heard if you suffer from bipolar disorder or hypomania, that not to use it because it will make the manic episodes much worse. There are many different species of Hypericums here in Arkansas. Hypericum hypericoides is one of those. Another would be Hypericum prolificum, but these have yellow flowers. They're shrubs, and they have other uses as well. The Native Americans would chew their root for snake bites. Root tea was used for colic, fevers, pain, toothaches, diarrhea, and dysentery. And the root tea has also been used externally as a wash for ulcerated breasts. Leaf tea used for bladder and kidney ailment, skin problems, and children's diarrhea. All right, so what about the herbaceous layer? These would be the little herbaceous plants that typically, or otherwise what we call forbs, they grow and they flower. So some examples would be spring beauties. And we see these growing in our yards. They do grow in the early spring in the forest, on the forest floor, typically before the leaves come out on the trees. They seem to like the sunlight, so they like to come out and do their thing before the trees leaf out and start shading out the forest floor. But all parts of this plant are edible. So the above ground part, the flowers, the leaves, the stems, everything, even the underground roots and corms are edible. You can roast those roots like little chestnuts, or just add the flowers and leaves to a salad. It's nothing remarkable about the flavor. It just tastes like a leafy green, for the most part, flavorless plant, but still nonetheless provides some nutrients. You can also cook them as well. White trout lilies. And there's different species of these. And usually when I see white trout lilies or yellow trout lilies, I don't see them spread all over like the prairie trout lilies. So the prairie trout lilies, when you see one, you usually see a ton of those all over the place. So those are going to be the ones I'd more recommend that you eat. Wouldn't take anything that we're only seeing a few species. We really only want to harvest something from the wild when it's already doing pretty good, and we're not going to be harming that population. But the trout lily leaves, nonetheless, are pretty tasty. They have a very what I would describe as like a nutty kind of flavor. It tastes very similar to fresh greenbrier shoots or asparagus, or Trillium leaves, if you've ever had those. But the corms of white trout lilies are also edible, but may be mildly emetic. So just keep that in mind. If you start to eat too many and get a tummy ache. Medicinal parts include the roots and leaves. The Native Americans would use root tea for fevers, leaf poultice for hard-to-heal ulcers. The Iroquois women ate raw leaves to prevent conception, so might have some birth control sort of properties there, so keep that in mind. Root poultice was also used to draw out splinters and reduce swelling. Fresh and recently dried leaves and roots are considered emetic as well as an expectorant. So if you need to cough some stuff up, loosen up your lungs, or getting something out of your tummy, that could be a way to do it. Externally, leaves are considered softening to the skin tissue, though they may cause an immediate allergic reaction. So just kind of be careful, see how you react to it first. You may be fine or you may not. So just be careful. And then, like I mentioned, the Trilliums, these are, I'm not familiar if these are, how easy these are to transplant. I do know that they're pretty common in the spring to find them growing. So if you have a food forest, you might already even have these growing out there. But the leaves can be collected before they flower. You can collect them after they flower, but the flavor is definitely best before they flower, and eaten raw or cooked. We have different species of Trillium here in the Ozarks. They have 3 leaves, 3 sepals, 3 petals, hence the name Trillium. And it's just a beautiful spring plant. We have some rare species, Ozark Trillium, that I don't recommend foraging or harvesting just because its population is very limited here in Arkansas. And just something to understand and be careful about is it's also been used as an aid in childbirth. Another term for this plant that the natives would call it was birth root. So if someone is pregnant, they probably don't want to consume this if they're not ready to get that baby out of them. So Native Americans would use the root tea for menstruation disorders, to induce childbirth, to aid in labor, as well as for menopause as a uterine astringent and aphrodisiac. The root contains steroids. So all kinds of great things for the ladies in the audience, used for coughs and bowel troubles as well. The whole plant can be used as a poultice for tumors, inflammation, and ulcers. Historically, physicians would use the root tea as above and for hemorrhages, asthma, difficult breathing, chronic lung disorders, externally for snake bites, stings, and skin irritations. All right, and then we have the mints. The mint family is, it's a pretty broad family here in the Ozarks, and you can typically find something in the mint family if it has a square stem or stalk and opposite leaves. So if you see two leaves coming off the stem at the same point, but opposite each other, one's coming off one side, the other off the other side, then you have that opposite leaf pattern. And then most, but not all of the mint families, the leaves are going to have an aromatic scent. So square stems, opposite leaves. And if you have an aromatic scent, then you 99% can be certain that you have something in the mint family. If it does not have an aromatic scent, it could still be in the mint family. And we'll cover some of those species here in a little bit as well. But the value behind the mints are those oils, those volatile oils that give it its aromatic scent. These spicy oils are stimulating and warming that can cause the body to open up and sweat. So they're often listed as diaphoretic in herbal books. Also, so because they're a diaphoretic, they can be used to break a fever, help raise your body temperature to help finally finish and cook off that whatever your body is trying to kill off by raising your body temperature, and that way your fever can come down. They're also these volatile oils are also highly lethal to microorganisms, so you can use them to purify questionable water. And especially Ozark calumet. If you are ever hiking around and come across some of that, if you take a few pieces and put it in your water bottle, not only do you have some really great tasting water, but it just helps keep the microorganisms down. All right, so what are some examples of our native mints? This could include the mountain mints or the Picanthemums. There's different species of these, but Picanthemum pilosum is one of those. These bloom during the summertime, but you'll see the leaves usually starting summertime all through the growing season. Fresh or dried leaves can be used for tea. Also, the leaves are medicinal. You can use them for a tea, use that tea for fevers, coughs, colds, colic, and stomach cramps. The Native Americans would make a poultice of the leaves and use that for headaches. Another species of Picanthemum, Pachantima muticum, also same uses as our hairy mountain mint as before. And then the Monardas. This is another genus in the mint family that we have several species of here, including Monarda bradburyiana. This is a pretty short growing species of Monarda. It maybe gets 1 to 2 feet tall, and the leaves and flowers can be used to make a tea. Medicinally, that tea can also be used for fevers, upset stomachs, digestive gas, and as a remedy for colds and coughs. Another species of Monarda here in the Ozarks is Monarda fistulosa. Also known as wild bergamot, The leaves have a very bergamonty type scent. So if you can take black tea and wild bergamot, you can make your own Earl Grey if you're wanting to. And like it has the same uses as the short bee balm. And another species with the same uses is dotted bee balm, Monarda Punctata, and this has some stacked flowers as opposed to flowers at the very top of the stalk like you see here with wild bergamot. And then downy wood mint, Blophilia ciliata. This is another one. The leaves can be used to make a tea just like any of the other mint family leaves. The Cherokee would use a poultice of fresh leaves of this plant for headaches. And then dittany, Canela Oreganoides. This is also known as wild oregano, and it's also one of the species of plants that creates frost flowers. So if you're familiar with frost flowers in the wintertime, those usually, you'll wake up some winter mornings and you see these white floral shapes at the base of these dead plants. This is one of the species that does that because it has a pithy center to that stem. So what happens is in the early morning, it's starting to wick up water from the ground, and that water, as it freezes and expands, it breaks through the base of the stem, and as more water comes out, kind of like an icicle forms, it just keeps coming out and then freezing and creates like this floral pattern as it goes through that process. And so those will usually be around in the first part of the morning, and as soon as the sunlight shines on them, they start to melt. Some of them will hang out on a cold enough day in the shady areas, into the later in the day, as long as the sun doesn't shine on them. But the leaves of this species can be used as a substitute for oregano. If you've ever come across this species, pick the leaves, smell it. It smells just like oregano. My wife likes to take this and use it in her own homemade pizza sauce, along with some homemade or homegrown Arkansas Traveler tomatoes. And so it's just a good local source of some wild oregano. It is also, the tea can induce perspiration. So again, it can be used to help break a fever. It's a folk remedy for colds, fevers, and headaches. And what else was I going to say about this? I can't recall. Anyway, all right, so Hill-all, Prunella vulgaris, and I'm not sure why they would call this vulgaris, because to me this is the least vulgar plant I've ever found, but it's called Hill-all because it's able to treat a wide array of different ailments. Another term you might hear this plant called by is called self-heal. It is edible. The leaves, stems, and flowers, all the above ground parts are edible. Can be eaten raw, so it contains all kinds of things that are good for you. This is in the mint family. It does not have any sort of aromatic scent. So this is one of those outliers that, like if anything, there's always that general rule, and then there are the outliers that don't follow that general rule. Medicinally, it can be used to treat hemorrhages, diarrhea, stomach troubles, fevers, boils, and urinary disorders. So a wide range of different parts of the body. Leaf tea used as a gargle for sore throats, mouth sores, bruises, and other sores. The plant possesses antibiotic, hypotensive, and antimutagenic qualities. Contains the anti-tumor and diuretic compound ursolic acid. Also rich in natural antioxidant components containing more rosmarinic acid than rosemary. So just an all-around good plant for good general health, whether it's eaten or used medicinally. And this should have gone into the shrub layer, but this is American beautyberry. I don't know why I have it here in the herbaceous layer, because this is not a herbaceous plant. This is a woody shrub, but it does produce edible fruit that you can use to make ripe, take the berries when they're ripe, make them into jams and jellies. These should be producing berries here pretty soon. Usually by October, you'll start to see these things covered in berries. Medicinally, the roots, berries, and leaves can be used. Native Americans would use the root and leaf tea and steam baths for rheumatism, fevers, and malaria. Root tea is also used for dysentery and stomach aches, and a tea made from the roots and berries has been used for colic. All right, then Aster family. This is a pretty large family. These have these composite discs. So this, another term you might hear is the sunflower family. So these composite flowers where you have these, it's actually multiple flowers in one flower head. The true flowers are actually right there in that middle disc. And those petals, they look like petals that come off the sides, I believe are actually false petals. And so when you see something that has that shape of flower, it is in the sunflower or aster family. So what are some examples? Well, purple cone flower. This is probably one of the most recognizable wildflowers here in Arkansas. Grows all over, easy to identify. It's also, the roots are medicinal, considered a non-specific immune system stimulant. You can chew that root or make it into a tea and use it for all kinds of things, for toothaches, burns, hard to heal sores, wounds, cold, and the flu. When I was a child, I would go dig these roots up and chew on them. We call it, I learned this when I was a Boy Scout, and I didn't know at the time that it was used medicinally. I just knew that if you chew on those roots, it makes your mouth tingle and feels numb. And then we would spit out our spit. Kind of has a sweet flavor. And I didn't realize it then, but when I got older, I learned that you can then swallow your spit to help with sore throat or tummy ache. So it's just kind of a good way to help, if you have a toothache, you can chew on it and it will help that numbing effect can be beneficial. It's also been used a lot to make extracts, salves, and tinctures, which can be used for wounds, herpes sores, canker sores, throat infections, as well as a preventative for flu and cold. Like I said, it's a immune system stimulant. It's also been used as a folk remedy for brown recluse spider bites. So the extracts, what they do is they enhance particle ingestion capacity of white blood cells and other specialized immune system cells. This increases their ability to attack foreign particles such as cold and flu viruses. Wild quinine, which also grows here in the Ozarks, is often used as an adulterant to the root of purple coneflower. So maybe you don't have enough of it for what you're needing to use it for. You can mix some wild quinine with it in its place. However, a word of warning, do not use this in cases of autoimmune disease or impaired immune system response, including tuberculosis, multiple sclerosis, and HIV. Also, just be aware that rare allergic reactions have been reported from use. Then black-eyed Susans, one of our Rudbeckias, Rudbeckia hirta. The roots are medicinal on this one as well. Just a word of warning, some people do report contact sensitivity to the plant. I was talking with somebody not too long ago that was found out that they would just get a little bit of a breakout anytime they had too much contact with black-eyed Susans. But the Native Americans would use the tea made from the root for worms, colds, and also would use that tea as an external wash for sores, snake bites, and swelling. Would also use the root juice for earaches. So like the purple coneflower, it also has immunostimulant activity. And then wild quinine, which we mentioned earlier. This is one that has medicinal leaves, flowers, and roots. Poultice can be made from the fresh leaves and applied to burns, pretty similar to like an aloe vera plant. Flowering tops are once used for intermittent fevers, such as malaria, or maybe now you might be having an intermittent fever from COVID. So I don't know if it's been successful for that. It would be interesting to hear if anyone's ever tried that or has had experience. But the root has been used as a diuretic for kidney and bladder ailments and for gonorrhea. So if you need to pass a lot of water, this could be helpful. Then common yarrow. This is another one that's pretty easy to recognize once you see those leaves. They're very feathery-like, and if you take one of those leaves and crush it between your fingers and smell it, has a very distinct scent, something that I just associate with yarrow. You can put a little bit in your mouth and nibble it. It's not an edible. I mean, but one of my old teachers taught me to to understand that it's medicine. It's not a food. So it's not going to hurt you if you put a little in your mouth, but it definitely does not taste good to just eat. I mean, it has its own flavor, but I mean, it's not, doesn't taste horrible, but it just wouldn't make a great meal. Definitely a medicine. It's used as a vulnerary to stop bleeding of wounds. You see the name there, Achillia Milifulium. That Milifolium refers to the million leaves. As you see, it has all that feathery leaf. But Achillia is a reference to the Greek god Achilles, and that is because the Roman soldiers would carry yarrow. There's an old world yarrow as well as the yarrow that grows here. They are different species, but the old world yarrow, the Romans would carry these when they went into battle to help stop bleeding of their wounds. And so Achilles had that Achilles tendon. And who was Achilles? Because he wasn't the god of war. We'll look this up real quick. Sorry. Was a hero of the Trojan War. Greatest of all Greek warriors. Okay, so that's why in the Iliad. So that's where the name Achillia comes from, is from that use for stopping bleeding of wounds. A tea from dried flowering plant can be used for colds, fevers, anorexia, indigestion, gastric inflammation, and internal bleeding. I'm not entirely sure on the reference to anorexia, how that might work. That's just the resource that one of the resources that I used to put this together listed. So to me, I think that might be a little potentially more of a psychological thing, or maybe it's just an appetite stimulant. I really don't know. The expectorant and analgesic and sweat-inducing qualities of some of the components may provide relief from cold and flu virus symptoms. And somebody doesn't have a muted mic. So I just want to remind everyone to mute your mics here. I'm going to mute some folks here. All right, then Jerusalem artichoke. Edible parts are the roots. This really should have gone in the rhizosphere, which I think that section's coming up. So this was one I missed. Yeah, but anyway, so let's just go ahead and cover it, because the tubers can be collected in the fall and winter and eaten sliced in, or eaten raw, cooked, or pickled. So as a winter food source, you just want to make sure that you're collecting the right root. I mean, there could be more than one root in that ground, and so um, I've seen these things grow side by side with poison hemlock, and that's just a mistake you don't want to make. What I recommend is just to be extra sure. If you know that there's something that could be growing nearby that you don't want to eat that root of, maybe tie a little thread or string around these plants before they go dormant. And that way, when you find them again, you can track and trace that stem down to the roots and make sure you're getting the correct root. Once you learn to identify those roots, they do look pretty distinctive, and you'll start to just recognize them. But if you're just starting out, you really don't want to make a mistake and get the wrong root. And then the solidagos, or the goldenrods. This one, Elm Leaf Goldenrod, for instance, the roots, flowers, and leaves are medicinal. The Native Americans would use the root for burns, flower tea for fevers, and crushed flowers are chewed for sore throats. Leaf extracts are diuretic and mildly antispasmodic, have been used to treat inflammatory diseases of the lower urinary tract, and in irrigation therapy to both prevent and treat urinary and kidney stones. Sweet goldenrod, pretty similar to the other goldenrods. This one, though, called sweet goldenrod or Solidago odora because it has that compound similar to anise. So if you like that black licorice flavor and you want some of that in your tea, this would be great to use. It has that same compound. The leaf tea is pleasant tasting, again, as long as you like black licorice, which I do, but I know some don't. So not everybody might consider it pleasant tasting, but it is definitely better tasting, in my opinion, than the other goldenrod teas. Used as a digestive stimulant, diuretic, and mild astringent. Has been used to treat stomach cramps, colds, coughs, fevers, dysentery, diarrhea, measles, and used externally as a wash for rheumatism and headaches. Warning, now this can cause allergies. The goldenrods can, but typically when people are allergic, they are actually allergic to ragweed, which blooms around the same time. They're both blooming now. So a lot of people have a ragweed allergy that they misattribute to goldenrod. So just keep in mind that, but that's not to say that you cannot be allergic to goldenrod. It is possible. All right, the mustard family is another pretty large family that virtually all the species in the mustard family are edible, although some taste better than others. They're all generally going to have that mustardy flavor in the leaf, kind of that bitterness that you would associate with the mustards. If you're going to try to identify one of these in the wild, you want to look at the flowers. So you'll see 4 petals and 6 stamens, and in those stamens, 4 are going to be tall and 2 will be short. So look very closely at the flower. You're looking for those characteristics, and if you found that, then you're can be pretty sure that you have a member of the mustard family and it is edible. So examples include cutleaf toothwort. This is another one that is a spring ephemeral. It comes out very early spring before any of the leaves on the trees have come out, and it's trying to take advantage of the time of year when the sunlight's hitting the forest floor. So it likes that sun, but it likes growing in those forest soils. So the entire plant is edible. The young leaves, upper stems, flowers, and tubers can be eaten raw. The young tubers, they do have a crisp texture and a peppery horseradish-like flavor. The leaves also have that better flavor that you would expect of a mustard. And then medicinally, the roots have been used as a folk remedy for toothaches. Some people say that cut leaf toothwort. The cut leaf is referred to the edges of those leaves that are have that serration, like a saw. Toothwort is a reference to its ability or usefulness for tooth ailments. So usually when you see WORT on a plant name, that means can be used for. So this can be used for your teeth. Now, that's not always going to be true, because you see some things called like liverwort that is called that because the leaf is shaped like a liver. And that just goes back to a time when people used to think that if something in nature was shaped like a human body part, well, it must be useful for that human body part, because at one point in time we thought that the world was created for us and that we're the center of the universe and all that sort of stuff. But that's not to say that there aren't still some of those names that do have that true folk remedy that might be backed up a little bit by science. So the Native Americans would chew the root for colds and use it as a poultice for headaches. Root tea would be gargled for sore throats, hoarseness, and to clear the throat. So maybe you're having some early spring crud going on, a sore throat, that sort of stuff. Maybe it's the early spring pollen. Maybe you're still trying to shake off winter or winter cold. This might be one that could be useful to you. And then peppergrass, Lepidium virginicum. This is one that grows pretty weedy, even in gardens, but it can be used as a pepper substitute. If you take those flowers or those seed pods and leaves, chew on them, they have a peppery flavor. Another common name for this is poor man's pepper. So just want you to keep that in mind. Even if you have a garden and you see this growing, maybe don't pull all of them out. Let a few grow and add it to your salad or use it as a pepper substitute in something you're cooking. You can take those seed pods and add it to a soup or stew. Medicinally, the leaves can be used. The bruised leaves, the Native Americans would use for poison ivy rash and scurvy, and a leaf poultice on the chest for croup. All right, and then here's that rhizosphere layer, that root layer that we should have included Jerusalem artichoke in. But Solomon seal. Now, this can be distinguished from false Solomon seal by the flowers. Notice on Solomon seal, those flowers dangle all along the bottom of the stem. On false Solomon seal, the flowers are at the end of the stem. It's like a terminal flower cluster. You don't see them all along the bottom. Now, the good news is, even though the leaves look very, very similar, they both have the same uses. So you're not going to harm yourself by mixing them up. The young shoots of these can be eaten raw, and the roots can be boiled or served the same as potatoes. Medicinally, the Native Americans would use the root tea for indigestion, for profuse menstruation, lung ailments, as well as to promote sound sleep, coughs, treat coughs as a laxative, as well as all kinds of other uses. It also contains saponins, which are things that cause things to set up like soap. So just keep that in mind. You might have, some people would report a soapy flavor, as well as also considered anti-inflammatory and astringent. And here's a picture of false Solomon seal. Notice where the flower is on that one. It's at the kind of a terminal flower. So, but the young shoots can also be eaten raw. So you're not going to harm yourself if you eat these. The Native Americans would use the root tea for constipation, rheumatism, stomach tonic, quote unquote female tonic. That's what the literature I read said. What that means, I don't know. Some of that stuff is kind of vague. You'll see things referenced as can treat female troubles. And my best guess is there was some dude back in the day that learned of it and just thought that that would be a useful enough description, because sometimes that's what guys do. And I apologize on behalf of all men. But root smoke and held for insanity. That's an interesting one. And also to quiet a crying child. So I wouldn't recommend blowing smoke into a crying child's face, but that's what it has been used for in the past. Leaf tea used as a contraceptive for coughs, externally for bleeding, rashes, and itch. Herbalists use tea to induce sweating and urination and as a blood purifier, and the berries are mildly cathartic. And these species also can look very similar to, let's see, somebody else unmuted. Yeah, I'm gonna mute you. Okay. All right, very similar to another one that you'll see in the spring called yellow flowered bellwort. One of the differences there, again, with that one, you can still eat that plant. You're not going to harm yourself by eating the young shoots of that one either, luckily, even though they all look very similar without the flowers. But there are differences in the way the leaves are connected on that one. They're a little more what's called perfoliate, so they wrap around the base of the stem, whereas these are what's called sessile, so the base of the leaf goes right up to the stem. All right, so what about a ground cover layer? Something that's going to grow laterally and create some good ground cover. Well, in the rose family, this is a pretty large, relatively large family, 50 different genuses. It includes our native wild roses as well as like the blackberries. But the fruits of these are going to be mostly edible. However, the vegetation, leaves and whatnot do contain tannins and have that astringent property. So just keep that in mind. I didn't include the wild blackberries because of all the thorns, although I do love collecting wild blackberries and wild raspberries. But I figured for a gardening kind of setting, you might want to use one of the thornless varieties of blackberries that have been developed by the University of Arkansas. So did not include them in this presentation. But wild strawberries, Fragaria virginiana, these are really delicious. They bloom in May and fruit in June. And they will grow like a carpet and spread out over an entire area. The berries can be eaten raw. They have all the flavor of a store-bought strawberry packed down into a small little size. The beauty of these is you don't get all that white flavorless part like you do in a store-bought strawberry. But this is a species where those store-bought strawberries were cultivated from. And unlike the store-bought strawberries where the seeds are on the outside of the fruit, these seeds are going to be kind of impressed into the fruit. And I believe I have some pictures you see here. These are some that these grow naturally out at my property. And so when we moved out there, we noticed that we had tons of wild strawberries growing all over the place. And every June, we also notice when these are in fruit that these wild, not wild, well, I guess wild, but these box turtles like to visit our property. And we have like 3 or 4 box turtles just kind of walking around eating these fruits, which are low to the ground. So great food for turtles. And, you know, these turtles have probably been visiting our place for the last 50 years, for all I know, or longer. And suddenly we showed up out there and decided to build a house, you know. So like, whoa, who are y'all? Why are y'all on our strawberry patch? But another thing to keep in mind is you do need 2 genetically distinct strawberry individuals in order for these to germinate these, since they do spread, they can spread clonally or asexually. And so when they do that, they're not creating a genetically distinct individual. They only get a genetically distinct individual when you have sexual reproduction, right? So when a fruit has been produced, that's when you're going to get that genetic distinction. And so you need at least 2 genetically distinct individuals before that pollen can germinate and create the fruit. If you start off with just one, or if you purchase one of these from a native nursery and you plant it out at your place, just keep in mind you might not see fruit until you start to have another wild strawberry individual somewhere not too far away. May apples, these will tend to grow and make kind of like a ground cover. They can get up to, halfway up your shin or so. And one thing I want to say is every part of this plant is toxic. The leaves, the fruit is even toxic until it is ripe. And when it's not ripe, it will be a light green color. When it is ripe, it will be yellow, and it'll also be kind of squishy, soft to the touch. When it's not ripe, it's still pretty firm. I heard a story from a friend of mine, Theo Witzel, was talking about when he was just getting started off in botany. He knew, or he'd heard that May apples are edible. He didn't know much beyond that. So he saw where some were kind of coming up from the ground. He took some of the leaves, decided to put it in his mouth and start chewing on it. And he said it's like his body started convulsing, like very violently. Like it was like his body just knew, like, you don't want this, get this thing out of you, don't swallow it. And he spit it out, and then he just didn't feel right the whole rest of the day. So just keep that in mind. I've also found it's hard to beat the critters to these things. They apparently will take them just barely ripe, or just, there's been years when I would be visiting May apple patches near my house, and I would go out there every day. I'd see some May apples. I'm like, all right, yeah, I'm going to come back, tomorrow they'll finally be ripe. Then I can harvest them, then I'll go back out there and something beat me to them either early that morning or during the night and ate the May apples. I've only been able to try one once. I got lucky one time. We went on a camping trip, and it was Memorial Day, and just right by our campsite was a beautiful May apple with a fully ripe fruit on there, yellow. The one I saw was shaped a little more closer to a banana pepper, you know, a little more elongated, you know, and so I took it and ate it, and it was delicious. It tasted just like an apple. So that's, I could tell you, that's why they get that name. I have heard, I have not tried this, but I have heard that you can take them just before they're ripe. If you don't want to risk, you know, coming back and a critter beating into it, take one and put it in a paper bag, just like you would help ripen some tomatoes. Maybe you can put some banana peels in there so they can release that was ethane gas that helps produce the compounds that help it, you know, ripen. So you might try that. Let me know if it works out. I've heard from one other person that said that he tries that, works for him. Fruits can be collected. Oh, that's what I've just said. So just keep this in mind, very toxic, and only try at your own risk. All right, finally, this vertical layer, since we're reaching 3 o'clock, we're pretty close to the end here, but wanted to throw in the wild grapes, the Vitis genus. We have different species of wild grapes here in Arkansas. So Vitis vulpina, or frost grape, summer grape, winter grape, doesn't fruit in the winter. I'm not entirely sure why it's called winter grape, but riverbank grape. So these are all wild grape species that you can grow to have growing up a tree or trellis, as well as purple passion flower. Now this is going to do better, you know, in an along the edge. You know, it likes more sun. You see it growing out in the prairie. You see it along forest edges. You know, definitely put this where it's going to get plenty of sun. But the fruits, buds, flowers, leaves, and seeds are edible. The interiors of the ripe fruit can be eaten raw or made into jelly or syrup. These should be ripe about now or getting close to ripe. And usually my experience, when they're ripe, they're starting to look a little shriveled, like you can see in this lower photo here. And if you open one up, there should just be these seeds covered in this gelatinous type wet, juicy material. And if you take that, pop it in your mouth, some people would just chew up the seeds. They're not going to hurt you. I usually suck all that juicy passion fruit flavored gelatinous stuff off the seeds and then spit the seeds out so that they can grow into new plants. But they are one of my favorite wild edible plants. So just keep that in mind. Also, leaves and roots are medicinal. Leaves can be used for tea as a mild sedative. You know, some people would use the leaves as a tea to help, you know, deal with anxiety, for muscle spasms, insomnia, help them sleep. I have had success using this plant to help me not just initiate sleep, but to maintain sleep. Just back when I went through a period where I was having trouble, I kept waking up and would just be up, and finally got through that, and with the help of some passion flower leaf. If you're interested in learning more, really highly recommend the book Foraging the Ozarks by Bo Brown. It's a good friend of mine. Met him, I guess it was almost 13 years ago at one of his wilderness schools in Missouri, and had the opportunity to introduce him at a few events. And I always like to say that it's the man that literally wrote the book on foraging the Ozarks. And he's got another one coming out also on foraging the Great Plains. So look for that one as well. Don Kurz wrote the book Ozark Wildflowers. And in this book, if there's some sort of folk use for some of these plants, he'll usually include it in the profile for each of those flowers. But it's also just a great book to learn your native species of wildflowers here in the Ozarks. If you're looking for some ethnobotanical references, there are 2 books by Daniel Moorman, Native American Food Plants and Native American Medicinal Plants. And this is basically just a reference you can look up by plant species, by tribe, or by element or use, and figure out what they were using. Different tribes were using different species for different uses. These were originally included in a single volume called Native American Ethnobotany, which was then later split up into these 2 volumes. But you can still get a hold of some out-of-print copies of this book, or you can find it as an online database at naeb.brit.org. And you can search by all kinds of different criteria. It's just a great resource to see what the Native Americans were using here at North America as food sources and sources of medicine and other uses. Botany in a Day is great for learning the different patterns of different plant families. It's a great resource to help you kind of quickly get a plant, if you're wondering what family a plant is in, getting you down to that family level. Beyond that, you have to look at other things to get it down to a genus or species, but at least getting familiar with different plant families in North America, that's a great one. He also has some useful information of each of if there's like a certain plant family that all the members of that family have this certain quality or use or property that makes it useful in some way or another. There's some information there on that. Stephen Foster, who recently passed away. He was a good friend of many of us over in the Eureka Springs area, but he wrote a lot on herbalism using native plants, especially had a whole book on Echinacea, the coneflower genus, nature's immune enhancer. He had some other guides that he wrote for Peterson Field Guides on medicinal plants of Eastern Central North America, as well as other topics, like he has the book for Peterson Guide on venomous animals and poisonous plants of North America. And if you're wanting to get more into that idea of like forest gardening or food forest, there are some great books out there. There's the original one by Robert Hart called Forest Gardening, Rediscovering Nature and Community in a Post-Industrial Age. A more recently published one is over here on the right, Farming the Woods. This is a wonderful resource, goes into everything from pawpaws, nuts, mushrooms, fungus, all kinds of great stuff. But yeah, just kind of looks at that permaculture approach to being able to grow food, medicine, and temperate forests. So a little more adapted to our part of the world. So with that, here is my contact information. If you would like to send me an email, feel free. I'm happy to provide these programs, especially if it's like a school group, a Boy Scout troop, or I'm sorry, even Girl Scout. I think they're just called Scouts now. Any sort of organization like that that's nonprofit or school group, with kids, adults, all sorts of stuff. Happy to come out and provide a program on various topics. You can go to my website, ozarkprimitiveskills.com, or follow me on Facebook, facebook.com/ozarkprimitiveskills. And that's where you can find out about any upcoming events that I have. Like I mentioned, I'll be teaching. Let me see here. Get you these dates if you're interested in learning how to make friction fire, or make fire by rubbing sticks together. I'm teaching a class at Hobbs State Park on October 1st at 10 a.m. Seating is limited in that class just because we have material that I need to use, but it is free. So if you're able to sign up for that, it may be full by now and they have a waiting list, or you can wait, and we'll be doing a class at the Ozark Natural Science Center on November 19th. So that will be, we'll focus on shelter building, fire building, and animal tracks and signs. That will be an all-day class. So you can go into onsc.us and sign up for that class. So that one will not be free, but the money that makes goes directly to the Ozark Natural Science Center. Other than that, I'm trying to think, I'll be doing, given the same program again for the Newton County Library, if you're interested. When am I doing that? I'll be in December. When is that? Well, just to let you know, if you want to learn more about animal tracks and signs, I'll be giving that class at Hobbs State Park. And I don't think we'll have a limit on that class, so feel free to sign up. We'll just go hiking through the woods and see what sort of animal tracks and signs we can find. But the Newton County Library program, that is, here it is, November 12th. So November 12th at noon. So if you're interested in that, reach out to the Newton County Library in Jasper. And you can come out, and that will be more of an in-person program. And so with that, are there any questions? Let's see. I'll open up the chat here. Feel free to unmute your mic.
Eric, it looks like there's a question about what social media sites do you follow for updates on pawpaw plants?
I guess I don't. I think it's mostly just been my friends that have been posting. Whenever they've gotten some ripe pawpaws, or had a good haul and finding some pawpaws in the woods, they'll get excited and post some pictures on their social media. So it's just been more of, I guess, that's my friends that I follow on there, not so much like an official site. I know there are, if you're interested in like, what are those mushrooms called? Morels. there's an Arkansas Morels Facebook group where people start to report when they first start to see them, and they're part of Arkansas. And that's a great way to keep up of when they're going to be ready wherever you are, because it is pretty local, very locally specific when those start to come out. I think the environmental conditions have to be just right. Any other questions? Oh, thank you, Cheryl, for putting that link in the chat.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you pick the leaves while they're green, can you just dry them and save them for when you do need them? Or do they have to be used while they're fresh?
Are we talking about pawpaw leaves?
Yeah, or several different kinds of things. Like, gosh, I can't remember the one. Like, I've got that plant with the little purple berries. I can't think of what it's called. The everberry or
beauty berry.
Beauty berry, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm trying to recall the usefulness on those leaves. Let me go back here. Some of the stuff I got to reference, it's not always on my brain, but I know the berries on those you'd probably want pretty fresh. As far as usefulness of the leaves, I imagine it might depend on the compound and what you're using it for. Let's see. Okay, so root and leaf tea, they typically, my best advice on that, since I have not tried that myself, would be I would imagine a dry leaf tea, which wouldn't be as strong as fresh leaf, would be my best guess. That some of those compounds might break down with time. I've had that same experience with passion fruit, or was it passion flower leaves? When I've had them dried for longer than a year, like I got some from the natural food store that just did not seem to do it like the ones I was collecting from the woods. And my best guess was that they were just older. So my best advice on that would just be to, if you're going to try it, and when you're doing so at your own risk, but just, you might start off with something dried. That way you're starting off with a smaller dose so that that, how it's going to affect you. And then if you want something fresher that's stronger, you might, try fresh leaves. But
I want to just toss in something here.
Sure.
I also have lilac bushes, and this year I cut the blooms while they were still fresh. There's only a little window of time for that. And I dried those blooms. Oh my God, the best tea ever.
Oh, really?
It smells heavenly, and it tastes so good.
Huh. Yeah, I've never heard of that. We have a lilac bush out at our place. We'll have to try that sometime. That sounds good. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let's see. Got some other, what else do we have here? Are we able to get the PowerPoint? Yes, you are. Feel free to email me. Go back to this final slide, ozarkprimitiveskills@gmail.com. And I would be happy to send you a copy of the presentation. Will this presentation be on YouTube? I think you'd have to talk to the Bentonville Library about that, but I know it is being recorded. Let's see, do you know how to use Achillia to stop bleeding? Crush the leaves and place on the wound. That's my understanding. It was used as a poultice. So yes, it's directly applying it. It can be done like that in the field. Place it directly on a wound, so, and it would just help stop the bleeding and tighten up those blood vessels. So I haven't had an opportunity to try that. I believe my wife has tried it with one of the kids on a minor wound. So I don't think it was like the kind that you would sustain in a battle, but it seemed to work well for that. I was late. Maybe you covered this, or what sort of other sorts of classes do you offer? Well, friction fire, like I have one of those coming up at ONSC in Hobbs State Park. And as well, I do everything from basketry to foraging, plant walks. Trying to think what else. Animal tracks and signs, making rope and cordage from plant fibers, building shelters. Building shelters from rope you've made yourself is always pretty fun, and especially if you get a chance to stay the night in those. That's always been some of my funnest memories, was building shelters and sleeping in them overnight when I was younger, in my 20s and 30s. And if you go to my website, I have a list there of everything that I'm able to help out with and teach. Follow Ames Orchard Facebook page for Paw Paws. That's a good idea. He's the gentleman I mentioned earlier that locally grows a bunch of Paw Paws. I believe he has them ripe, and he's already announced that there's some available, and they're probably gone by now. But he's already given some to Ozark Natural Foods. So follow him to find out when they're there and try to beat the crowd to go pick them up. Do you know if there are any types of classes for foraging in the central Arkansas area? I'm sure there are. A lot of the people I knew there have since moved away. I know there's a Central Arkansas Foragers Facebook group. And I have friends that are into this that live in Central Arkansas, but I don't know if they teach classes. But I think that's something to just kind of look into. You might just try networking. Or if you come to some of the classes that are at like the Ozark Folk Center, they have a medicinal plant class every spring. A lot of people come up from Central Arkansas to that. So it's a great way to make local connections. Just try to go to these events when you find out about them and meet people would be my best advice there. Heather says that they will post this on the library's YouTube. Great. Let's see. Are there any university botany courses that specialize in medicinal edible plants? I don't know. I'm not aware of any. I know I gave a program for the New York Institute of Technology School of Osteopathic Medicines. They have a satellite campus at ASU in Jonesboro. It's a long name, but within those med students, there was a wilderness medicine student organization. And so they asked for me to give a program for them. So I went out and gave a 2-hour program. But other than that, I mean, I don't know if there are anything like this at a university. There may be. I've just never heard of it. Where do you go to have a career like yours? Well, my career, I'm an environmental consultant. So I went to school and I studied environmental soil and water science at the University of Arkansas. And I worked for engineering firms doing environmental impact studies, ecological assessments, and go out looking for endangered species, assessing natural resources and ecosystem services for conservation agencies and cities and stuff like that. So vegetation management plans for solar projects where they're wanting to do pollinator plantings on their solar panels, that sort of stuff. So I just happened to be into this as my little side interest. So I didn't really go to school, but I've just done a lot of these workshops, learned from a lot of experts in this area, have friends that, write in this area, and just try to absorb as much as I can from people like Bo Brown and Stephen Foster and other experts, Tina Marie Wilcox out at the Ozark Folk Center. Just try to get as much as I can from them. And any other questions? Get classes via Zoom through the University of Arkansas Extension Service. Yeah, that's another. I appreciate everybody, the kind words. Unless there's any other questions, I'll probably leave it at that. I appreciate y'all sticking with me, even though we went 20 minutes over.
Eric, thank you so much for doing this program.
Certainly. Happy to do it.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Good.
So
thank you
for taking time out of your weekend for us.
Happy to do it. Yeah, anytime. And looking forward to providing more of these in the future for your Bentonville Library.